Tuesday, June 25th. Nothing much happened today. Midge and I cleaned out the front part of the barn. We found an old table to use for a desk and 3 or 4 chairs so that we could sit down. She washed the windows and I managed to get the big front doors open and aired out the place. Agony located another turtle and I made a small wire pen and put it and the turtle I found Sunday into it. It certainly pays to advertise. People are beginning to notice my sign. I saw a number of people driving by in cars who paused for a minute to read it. I think almost everyone in Grover's Corner has seen it. I'm sure that Apples have. The reason I know is that Mr. Apple came over to see Uncle Al tonight. I didn't know Mr. Apple when he came to the door. He's a funny little man with a round head that's much too big for his body. He's almost bald, but what hair he has he allows to grow long and combs it across the top of his head and fools nobody except for himself. He's very precise and definite about everything he does, and you can tell that he's just as pleased with himself as it's possible to be. I answered the door. "Is Mr. Harris at home?" he asked. I invited him in, which I wouldn't have, had I known who he was or what he wanted. Anyhow, he and my uncle sat down in the living room, and since they didn't ask me to leave, I didn't. "What can I do for you, Mr. Apple?" my uncle said. He was polite, but he was in a hurry. I knew because there was a good fight coming on television at 9 o'clock, and it was 9:15 then. "You are the owner of a property adjacent to mine, are you not?" Mr. Apple asked. "No, that belongs to my sister," Uncle Al replied. "Hank's father and mother. Hank, have you met Mr. Apple? Mr. Apple, this is my nephew, Henry Reed." "How do you do?" Mr. Apple said, rather frostily. "Henry Reed. Is that your name printed on the barn on the property of which I speak?" "If you mean Henry Reed, Inc., Pure and Applied Research, that's me," I answered. "I see," said Mr. Apple with a cold smile. Then he turned away from me as though I were 2 years old and said to my uncle, "I presume you are in charge of the property?" "Well, in a way, yes," Uncle Al admitted. "Why?" "Well, it concerns this question of research," Mr. Apple said. "As you know, this area is zoned residential. Now, I believe that you will find upon examining the zoning regulations that all commercial uses are excluded from a residential zone A, unless they have already in existence at the time the zoning law became effective." "You may be right," admitted Uncle Al. "I suppose that sign misled you. My nephew here is quite a good artist. When I noticed that sign for the first time, I was sort of startled myself. It looks like a professional job. I understand what you're worried about. You thought there might be some huge building going up on the lot. Well, you've got nothing to worry about." "Then your nephew is not going to continue with his activities there?" Mr. Apple asked. Uncle Al looked startled, sort of like a surprised St. Bernard. "As I explained, Mr. Apple, it's only my nephew, this young lad here." "I fail to see how age enters into the question," Mr. Apple said very precisely. "Commercial activities are specifically prohibited. Whether the proprietor is young or old does not matter." Uncle Al lowered his head and looked at Mr. Apple from under his shaggy eyebrows. "Do you seriously mean, Mr. Apple, that you would object to Hank here and that glass girl conducting some sort of little business on that vacant lot during the summer?" "I most certainly would," Mr. Apple replied firmly. "Whether children conduct the business or not is sheer sentimentality. The question that's important here is whether the law is or is not being broken." "Hank, have you sold anything from that barn?" Uncle Al asked abruptly. "No," I said. "Has anyone paid you for any services that you have performed on that property?" "Not yet." Uncle Al turned back to Mr. Apple. "Mr. Apple, I suggest you wait until you're hurt before you holler. Good night." Mr. Apple got up to leave. I opened the door for him so he wouldn't be delayed. For a while I thought I'd be out of business before I got started. Uncle Al was mad. He stomped around the room, muttering to himself, forgetting the fight completely. Aunt Mabel came downstairs, and he told her what had happened. She got quite indignant about it, too. Uncle Al poked through his desk and hunted around until he finally came up with a copy of the zoning law. He sat down in his easy chair and read different parts of this for almost half an hour. Finally, he gave a throaty chuckle. "All right, I think we've got 'em," he said. "It says here, all other provisions notwithstanding, that a farmer has right to sell the product from his land and that he can put up whatever sign he deems necessary to sell it." "Okay, That land was a farm years before Mr. Apple moved into town. So you just changed the nature of your business. Right beneath the sign you have put agriculture and biological research supplies. Then you can list whatever you want to sell, your turtles, your pigeons, and your rabbits. They're all agriculture products and he can't do a thing. What if someone comes and wants me to perform some research for them? I asked. Well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it, Uncle Al replied. Offhand, I'd say go ahead and take any job you can get. In the meantime, I'm going to write him a letter from the office tomorrow and point out that this agriculture supply business is perfectly legal.